The envelope was not delivered. It was retrieved. That distinction matters more than anything else that will follow in this video. So let it settle for a moment. The letter that has now reached Charles III did not arrive through a courier, was not handed over by a secretary, was not surfaced in a review of correspondence. It was retrieved, pulled from a sealed archive that had not been opened since the year it was placed there, in the final decade of the previous reign, tucked inside a private file that bore no label visible to junior staff, only a small handwritten notation on the tab in ink that has faded to the color of old rust. That notation, sources close to the matter say, was in Queen Elizabeth II's own hand, and the notation said, simply, "For Charles, when the time comes." The time, apparently, has come. Sources familiar with what happened describe a morning in the private study at Windsor, a room that Charles has used since the early months of his reign, a room with low shelves and a desk positioned so the light falls from the left, where a monarch can sit and read without casting shadow over the page. It was there, according to people with knowledge of the moment, that the King of England sat with a single envelope on the desk in front of him and did not open it for a very long time. The envelope itself, by every account that has reached outside the palace, is not theatrical. It is cream-colored, standard archival weight, the kind the royal household uses for internal correspondence meant to last. The flap was sealed, not glued in the modern way, but pressed and stamped with a small oval impression, barely visible unless held at an angle to the light. The address on the front is written in a hand that sources describe as unmistakably Elizabeth's. Upright, slightly compressed, the letters formed with a deliberate economy that people who knew her handwriting well would recognize from across a room. There is no flourish. There is no sentiment on the outside. Just a name. Just his name. Charles reportedly did not open it immediately. He sat with it for a period that sources describe as uncomfortably long, long enough that a member of his household staff, who had brought it to him with an explanation of where it had been found, waited for acknowledgement and received none. The king's hands were flat on the desk on either side of the envelope, not holding it, not reaching for it. His posture was straight in the way that has nothing to do with discipline and everything to do with the body preparing itself for something. His eyes did not move from the envelope. He did not blink often. The light through the window caught the side of his face, and he sat in it without appearing to feel it. When he finally opened it, carefully, methodically, running a thumb beneath the sealed flap rather than tearing, the pages inside were folded in thirds, the way formal correspondence always was in his mother's time. The paper was the same archival cream, and the handwriting on the first page was the same hand from the envelope. Upright, compressed, exact. Not a word crossed out. Not a correction visible anywhere on the page. Written as if composed fully in the mind before the pen ever touched the paper. He read it once through without stopping. Then he set it face down on the desk. Then he sat without speaking for a very long time. And the only reason any of this matters, the only reason this becomes the kind of thing that people inside the institution cannot stop talking about, is what sources say the letter contains. Because what Queen Elizabeth wrote, before she sealed that envelope and placed it where it would not be found until she was gone, touches two people that Charles can never be neutral about. It touches his sons, and what it says about them, what she feared, what she instructed, what she assessed, has placed Charles in a position that sources describe as one of the most impossible of his reign. Not politically, not constitutionally, personally. In the way that only a letter from a mother can place a man. What you are about to hear is me putting the pieces together the way I read them, not a palace press release. To understand why this letter exists at all, you have to understand something about Queen Elizabeth II that the public rarely saw and the institution rarely discusses directly. Elizabeth was, by every credible account, a meticulous and private documentarian of her own reign. The image that settled around her, stoic, ceremonial, the embodiment of continuity rather than calculation, was accurate as far as it went, but it obscured something significant. She kept private records. Not diaries in the romantic sense, but something more functional, sealed letters, private assessments, instructions written in her own hand and placed in archival storage, with specific conditions attached to their retrieval. People familiar with royal household practice, historians and former staff who have spoken broadly about the institution, describe this as a practice with genuine historical precedent. Sovereigns who understood that their successors would face decisions they could not foresee have, across centuries, left private guidance. The practice is less dramatic than it sounds, and more consequential than it appears. It is the monarch speaking past the grave, not to the public, not to Parliament, not to the institution in any official sense, but to a specific person, about a specific matter, in a voice that only the two of them could fully decode. Elizabeth was extraordinarily careful about this. Her private letters, when they have surfaced, are never carelessly worded. They are not warm in the obvious way. They are precise. They say what they mean, and they mean exactly what they say. There is no room in them for misinterpretation, which means there was never room in them for comfort through ambiguity. If Elizabeth wrote something down and sealed it, she had considered every word, and she had decided that those particular words, in that particular order, needed to exist in a form that could not be denied. The question of why she would write a letter specifically about William and Harry, specifically about Diana's sons, sealed for Charles, requires sitting with the timeline of when it was most likely written. Sources with knowledge of the matter suggest the letter dates from the period between Diana's death in 1997 and the early 2000s. That window is not incidental. That window is the period during which Elizabeth was watching two young boys grow up inside an institution that had, in the most public and catastrophic way imaginable, failed their mother. And she was watching Charles, grieving, constrained, trying to rebuild, navigate his relationship with those boys without the person who had been the emotional center of their world. She wrote the letter, sources say, because she was not certain that what needed to be said would ever be said otherwise. Because there are things a sovereign can observe that a father cannot. Elizabeth's position gave her a view of William and Harry that was institutional as well as personal. She could see not just the boys, but what they would become, what the monarchy would require of them, and where those two things might not align. And because, sources suggest, she knew Charles's capacities and his blind spots, and she knew there were things she needed him to understand about his sons that she was not certain he would arrive at on his own. That is the institutional context for the letter's existence. A sovereign preparing her successor, a mother preparing her son, a grandmother trying to leave something that might help, or, depending on how you read what sources say the letter contains, something that might constrain. Diana did not leave behind only grief. That is the thing that gets lost in the years of documentaries and anniversary retrospectives, and the careful management of her image by everyone who has a stake in it. Diana left behind a very specific set of relationships, a very specific set of fears, and a very specific set of words. Words she spoke to people close to her in the years before her death. Words that those people carried with them into the decades that followed. And words that have shaped, in ways both visible and invisible, the institution that her sons eventually became part of. What Diana left inside the palace, not at the gates, not in the public memory, but inside the actual walls of the institution, was a complicated inheritance. She had worked, in the years after her separation from Charles, to build something with William and Harry that was different from what the monarchy typically produced. She had taken them to homeless shelters and hospitals, introduced them to people outside the formal circles that princes normally encounter, and been deliberate, by every account, about giving them an understanding of the world that the institution itself would not provide. This was not accidental. It was, sources familiar with her thinking suggest, a conscious act of preparation, a belief that her sons needed to carry something inside them that the institution could not give them and could not take away. She was also, by every credible account, afraid for them. Not simply afraid that the palace would be cold to them, but afraid in a more specific and more uncomfortable way. She was afraid of what would happen to them when she was no longer between them and the institution. She understood, with a clarity that came from experience rather than paranoia, that the monarchy has a way of absorbing people, of taking a person's private self and gradually replacing it with a public function. She had watched it happen. She had felt it happening to herself. And she looked at her sons and she spoke, to people close to her, about what she hoped for them and what she feared. With William, the fear was particular. Sources who were close to Diana in the mid-1990s describe conversations in which she talked about William's nature, his seriousness, his emotional depth, his tendency to absorb the weight of other people's needs. She worried, these sources say, that the monarchy would take those qualities and calcify them, that the training and the duty and the relentless formality would turn what was potentially a great emotional intelligence into a kind of permanent containment. She wanted William to be more than a function. She was not certain the institution would allow it. With Harry, the fear was different, but equally specific. Diana understood that Harry's position, second son, outside the direct line of succession in any consequential way, less scrutinized but also less supported, left him exposed. William had a role, a defined trajectory, a set of expectations that at least provided structure. Harry had room, which is another word for absence. Diana spoke to people close to her about Harry with something that sources describe as a particular tenderness and a particular anxiety, a sense that he needed to be held more carefully because the institution would hold him less. She worried about what happened to people the monarchy needed, but did not fully claim. And then she was gone. The summer of 1997 arrived and she was gone, and the two boys she had worked so carefully to prepare were suddenly inside the institution, without the person who had been translating between their inner lives and its demands. Charles was their father, and Charles tried. By every account of people who have spoken about that period, he genuinely tried. But sources close to the family describe the years after Diana's death as a period in which William and Harry navigated something enormous, largely by finding their own way through it, supported by people around them, shaped by the institution's rhythms, but missing the specific thing Diana had been for them. Elizabeth watched all of this. She was always watching, and what she saw, sources suggest, informed every word of the letter she eventually sealed and set aside. The first section of the letter, as sources familiar with its contents describe it, concerns William, and the tone of what Elizabeth wrote about her eldest grandson is something that sources say is difficult to characterize simply, because it contains things that are admiring and things that are worried, often in the same breath, in the way that Queen Elizabeth's assessments always compressed enormous amounts of observation into very few words. Elizabeth's assessment of William as a future king, sources say, was not unconditionally positive. That is the first thing that lands, and it lands hard, because the public narrative around William has largely been one of a carefully prepared, solidly anchored successor, positioned to be exactly what the monarchy needs him to be. Elizabeth, in private, saw something more complicated. She saw a man who was capable of great things, and who was carrying, inside that capability, something she feared could harden into something less useful. Sources describe the language she used about William as clinical, in the way that felt almost like a medical assessment. She wrote about his strengths with precision, his steadiness, his understanding of the institution, his capacity to endure scrutiny without being undone by it. These are not small things. These are exactly the qualities a sovereign needs, and Elizabeth named them without sentimentality. But then, sources say, she wrote about what concerned her. And what concerned her about William was not his character. It was the relationship between his character and what the monarchy was doing to it. Elizabeth had watched William, across more than 2 decades, become incrementally more formal, more defended, more invested in the containment of himself. She had watched him close. She had watched him manage. And she was not certain that this was only royal training producing the right results. She feared, and this is the word sources use, feared, that what she was seeing was something Diana had recognized in William from the beginning, and specifically tried to prevent, happening anyway. The gradual replacement of a complex interior life with a function. The instruction she left for Charles regarding William is something that sources describe carefully, because none of the people who have spoken about it are certain they have every detail exactly right. But the shape of it, as best as can be reconstructed, is this. Elizabeth instructed Charles to protect something in William that William himself might not be aware he needed protected. Not something specified with clinical precision, but something related to his private life, his family, the people around him outside the institutional apparatus. She wrote, by every account, something to the effect that a king who has no life that is genuinely his own will eventually govern from a hollowness that the public will feel before he does. That sentence, or something very close to it, is in the letter, and Charles, when he read it, would have known exactly what his mother was describing. Because Charles has been inside that hollowness, he has lived it. There is also, sources say, something in the William section that touches on Catherine, on the relationship between the heir and his wife, what Elizabeth observed, what she hoped for, and more quietly, what she worried about. Sources do not overstate what they know here. But the suggestion is that Elizabeth did not simply leave William a commendation. She left him a challenge. And she left Charles the responsibility of making sure William received it. The section of the letter concerning Harry is, by every account that has reached outside the palace, different in tone from the section concerning William. Not warmer exactly, not softer, but different in a way that sources struggle to characterize, because it does not fit the narrative that has attached itself to Harry in the years since his departure from the family's institutional life. Elizabeth, in writing about Harry, was not cold, and she was not, sources say, simply documenting a problem child. What Elizabeth wrote about Harry was, according to people familiar with the letter, something closer to an act of witness. She had watched Harry navigate the impossible geometry of his position, inside the family but outside the succession in any consequential way, visible enough to attract attention but without the defined role that gives visibility a purpose. And she had seen something in how he moved through that position that she apparently felt needed to be recorded. Sources say she wrote about Harry with a specificity that suggests she had thought about him independently, as a person in his own right. What she observed, or what sources describe her as having observed, was that Harry had inherited something from Diana that William had not, or not in the same form. He had inherited Diana's rawness, her directness, her inability to perform the containment that the institution requires without it costing him something visible. Sources describe the Queen's assessment of this quality as a recognition, a clear-eyed acknowledgement that this quality was both the most compelling thing about him and the thing most likely to put him in conflict with the institution he was supposed to serve. The instruction Elizabeth left regarding Harry is the thing sources describe as the part of the letter nobody expected, the thing that apparently shifted the atmosphere in the room when it became known, or partially known, to the small number of people now aware of the letter's existence. Because the instruction, as sources reconstruct it, was not to manage Harry. It was not to constrain him. It was not to bring him into line. The instruction, sources say, was something closer to the opposite. Elizabeth wrote, as sources reconstruct it, with the caveat that exact wording is unavailable to anyone outside a very small circle, that Harry should not be allowed to become, in her words or words close to hers, the institution's convenient explanation for everything that went wrong. She wrote that Harry was not the problem he had been made into, and that Charles, as king, needed to carry that understanding even when he could not act on it publicly. She wrote something connecting what she saw in Harry to what she had understood, in retrospect, about Diana, about what the institution did to people who could not contain themselves for it, about what it cost to manage that kind of person from the outside rather than hold them from the inside. Sources say there is a paragraph in the Harry section unlike anything else in the document. A paragraph where the compression gives way slightly, not to sentiment, but to something that might be called a reckoning. A place where Elizabeth appears to have allowed herself to write something she had never said aloud, about what she might have done differently, about the years after Diana, about choices the institution made that she either authorized or permitted. That paragraph, sources say, is why Charles sat with the letter face down on the desk for as long as he did. Camilla did not learn what the letter contained in the way you might imagine. She did not sit across from Charles as he read it aloud to her. She did not receive a calm, rational summary. She learned, sources close to the matter describe the sequence carefully, through a series of partial disclosures, each one landing in a slightly different way, over a period of hours, that sources describe as among the more difficult those inside the palace have observed in recent memory. The letter, according to people familiar with its contents, does not ignore Camilla. It does not pretend she does not exist. Elizabeth named her. By every account that has surfaced, the Queen named Camilla in the letter, and what she wrote is something that sources describe with careful, measured language, not because they are protecting anyone, but because the full content is not available to them either. What sources do say is this: the letter contains a passage regarding Camilla's authority, specifically, the limits of it. Not a denunciation, not an attack, something more precise, and, in its precision, more permanent. Elizabeth, who understood better than most people the difference between a position and the authority that fills it, apparently wrote something that distinguishes between Camilla's title and what that title does or does not confer in terms of institutional standing with regard to Diana's sons. The passage, as sources describe it, is written in the same clinical language as everything else, the language that does not raise its voice because it does not need to. Camilla, when she understood the shape of what the letter contained, when she had gathered enough of the partial information to understand not just that the letter existed, but what it said. Sources describe her reaction as a particular kind of stillness, not the stillness of someone who has accepted something. The stillness of someone deciding, very carefully, what the terrain looks like before they move. Sources describe it as a stillness that people close to her recognized as meaningful, because it is the stillness she deploys when something has landed in a way she had not anticipated. She had, by every account, expected that whatever Elizabeth had left behind would eventually arrive. There is no version of the post-Elizabeth palace in which a person of Camilla's intelligence had not considered this possibility. What sources suggest she had not fully anticipated was the specific nature of what the letter said, not the existence of constraints, but the precision of them. Not the acknowledgement that her position had limits, but the degree to which those limits appeared to have been considered and written down with reference to Diana's children specifically. There is something Camilla was counting on, sources say, that the letter now complicates. Something regarding her standing in relation to William and Harry, not in terms of royal titles or ceremonial function, but in terms of the informal authority that accumulates around the person closest to the king. Camilla had, in the years since Charles's accession, been building something. Quietly, methodically. The letter, sources suggest, contains something from Elizabeth that speaks directly to that accumulation. Something that names it and says something about it that is not warm. The moment Camilla fully understood what she was dealing with, sources say, the room held a particular quality of silence. The kind of silence that means the ground has shifted and nobody is ready to say so out loud yet. Here is the thing about Charles that is easy to miss if you have only been watching from the outside. He is a man who has spent a very long time learning to hold contradictory things simultaneously. He has held love and obligation in tension for most of his adult life. He has held his public function and his private self in a relationship that has not always been comfortable. He has held his relationship with his sons and his relationship with his wife. And the places where those two things do not perfectly align have been some of the most visible fault lines of his reign. The letter has placed those fault lines under a particular kind of pressure. Not because it is a surprise that his mother had views about his sons, or that those views were complicated, or that they were written down somewhere, but because what she wrote is now in his hands. It is physical. It is in her handwriting. It has the specific, immovable quality of her voice, that compressed, precise, unmistakably Elizabeth voice, and it says things about his sons that he cannot unhear and cannot unknow, and it says things about his wife that he cannot pretend are not there. Sources describe Charles's position in the days since the letter surfaced as a kind of enforced stillness that is not peace, the kind of stillness that comes from a man who is processing something very large and has not yet arrived at a way to act on it. He is, by every account from people who have observed him in this period, doing what he always does when something is too complicated to address directly. He is moving through the public obligations, conducting the formal business, present in the ways that presence is required. And underneath all of that, sources say, he is sitting with a document written by his mother that forces him to choose between things he cannot sacrifice. He cannot dishonor the letter. That is not who he is. It is not what his relationship with his mother was, and it is not what his understanding of the monarchy requires. His mother sat down and wrote those pages and sealed them for him, knowing he would be the only person who fully understood what she was telling him and why. To set the letter aside, to read it once and fold it back into its thirds and proceed as if it does not exist, would be to do something to his relationship with her memory that sources say he cannot do. But he also cannot act on the letter in every direction simultaneously. Acting on what it says about William means a conversation that will require saying things that are uncomfortable and true. Acting on what it says about Harry means a recalibration of something calcified by years of public difficulty, one that cannot happen quickly, and will require a degree of vulnerability that sources say he approaches with enormous difficulty. And what the letter says about Camilla, about the limits Elizabeth named, the standing she specified, is something Charles cannot act on without affecting his wife in ways that go beyond the institutional. He loved his mother. He loves his wife. He loves his sons, in the complicated, sometimes insufficient, sometimes overpowering way that he has always loved them. And his mother's letter has placed those loves in a configuration where serving one of them fully means not serving another fully. Sources describe him in this period as carrying the letter, not literally, but in the way a significant thing makes itself felt in the body of the person holding it, in the slight forward set of his shoulders, in the quality of his attention in meetings, which is present but not entirely present, in the way he moves through Windsor, with the look of a man who keeps arriving at a question he cannot yet answer. The atmosphere inside the palace, since the letter's retrieval, is something that sources describe in terms that are careful but consistent. The people who know the letter exists, sources suggest that number is very small, perhaps 4 or 5 people beyond Charles himself, are carrying that knowledge in the way you carry something that changes the room without anyone knowing why. The ordinary business of the institution continues. The audiences, the correspondence, the ceremonial functions. From the outside, nothing has visibly changed. But the atmosphere, sources say, is different. It has the quality of a space in which something significant has happened and has not yet been addressed. A kind of institutional breath-holding. People close enough to feel the shift, but not close enough to know its source, are aware that something is different in the way Charles is moving through his days. Not in the public performances, in the private moments, in the quality of silence that has settled around certain subjects that used to be discussed more openly. William's reaction, to the extent that sources can speak to it, is complex. He knows the letter exists. He does not know everything it contains. Sources are careful to specify this because the distinction matters enormously. He knows his grandmother left something for his father that concerns him, but does not yet know the specific nature of what she assessed or instructed. And that partial knowledge has produced in William a quality of alertness that the people around him recognize. He is watching his father more carefully than usual. He is, sources say, in that particular mode he enters when he knows something is coming and cannot yet see its shape. Anne's role in all of this is something sources mention but do not illuminate fully. The Princess Royal is, by every account, one of the people whose opinion Charles trusts most precisely because she does not manage him. She says what she thinks. Sources suggest Anne is aware of the letter's existence, not its contents, but its existence, and that she has said something to Charles about it that was characteristically direct. What she said, sources do not specify, but that Charles received it in the particular way he receives her directness is noted by people who have observed them together in this period. The question that people inside the palace cannot stop turning over, according to sources familiar with the current atmosphere, is not what the letter says. It is what Charles will do about it. Because what a king does with his mother's last private words, how he honors them, how he weighs them against the life he has actually built, is the kind of question that does not have a procedural answer. It has only a personal one, and Charles has not yet given it. There is a room in Windsor that Charles has been returning to more often than usual in recent weeks, according to sources who have reason to know his movements within the castle. It is not the study where he read the letter. It is an older room, less formally furnished. The kind of room that accumulates meaning over a long life, rather than being assigned it by design. There are photographs in it, the private kind, not arranged for any official purpose. Sources say there is a photograph in that room that shows Elizabeth and Charles and Diana together, from sometime in the 1980s, from a moment before everything became what it became. The three of them in an ordinary posture, just there. Sources say Charles has been seen standing in that room on more than one occasion, in the early part of the day, before the formal business begins. Not sitting, standing. Looking at things in the room in the way you look at things when you are not really looking at them, but thinking through something they remind you of. Standing in the light that comes through the window at that hour, which is the particular quality of early light that makes old rooms look exactly as old as they are. The letter is not in that room. The letter is in the study, in the desk, somewhere accessible but not visible. The kind of placement that means a person wants to be able to reach it without having to see it every time they sit down. The letter is there. It has been there since the morning he read it. It is cream-colored, archival weight, 3 folded pages in his mother's upright, compressed hand, and it says things about his sons and his wife that only he fully understands the weight of. It is permanent, and it is not going anywhere. And somewhere in the gap between the room with the photographs and the desk with the letter, there is a king trying to work out how to be a son, a husband, and a father simultaneously, when the document his mother left him makes all 3 of those things press against each other in ways they have never pressed before. That is where this sits. A letter sealed for 25 years, written by a queen, retrieved into a reign defined by the weight of what came before it. A letter about 2 sons who grew up inside an institution that lost their mother. A letter that Charles cannot unknow and cannot fully act on without choosing who he is willing to fail. The letter exists. The king knows what it says. What he does next is something that sources say even the people closest to him cannot yet predict. This channel provides content for entertainment and commentary purposes. Our videos feature a combination of public sources, historical context, opinions, and speculation. Statements should not be interpreted as established facts. The light in Windsor is the same light it has always been. The institution continues its rhythms. And somewhere in it, a man is sitting with his mother's words and deciding, in private, as sovereigns always have decided the most consequential things, what they mean and what they cost, and whether he has the capacity to honor them. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.